And welcome back to the Flow Sports Fix on this Thursday evening. And once again, I'm joined by the Flow Man and the Stat Man into the studio. And it's time to talk local football, and especially, and I'll get you to help me out on this, Stat Man, the 666 rule. And you recently had a conversation with the great Spud McKay, who's had some interesting thoughts. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. Look, the AFL, I've long, and regular listeners to Flow will know that this is my opinion. I've long been of the opinion that the AFL should not be the governing body of the sport, and that it's quite inward-looking without factoring in ramifications of certain decisions it makes, particularly when it comes to rules of the game, on the broader scope of football, and it just looks at the elite competitions and doesn't really look outside of it to country footy and more localised footy. Now, I was talking to Spud McKay about the discrepancies in scores in one of our local leagues that we cover, which is Northern Areas football, and there was 2 weeks in a row where the losing teams really, I think, scored maybe 2 goals in matches in the A grade, like all through the 6 different fixtures. It was a terrible couple of weeks in terms of scores and the quality of the local games. And in fact, this is what Spud had to say about a rule that was changed by the AFL and has now filtered into local competition, the 666 rule, and the impact that he believes it's had on the scores.
Footy has changed drastically over the last couple of years. Since they brought in this 666, where you must start with 6 in your forward line, 6 in the center, across the centre, and 6 in the back line. And what that does is it prevents you from putting players behind the ball, and it means then that the teams with the best on-ballers, e.g. Orroroo, Broughton, Mundura, have a huge advantage there, because if they win it out the centre, most times it's going to be a one-on-one contest when the ball goes forward, and that gives you then, like Daniel Hill, Darren Shillabeer, that last week, they just were able to do as they wanted to, because it was coming in just in a one-on-one contest, and those players then dominate. So I think that's probably hindered the footy out here a little bit in the country.
So there you go. Now, I don't know if Spud's right or wrong on this. So basically, if you read between the lines, what he's saying is, once upon a time, you used to be able to put a man behind the ball. Yep. If you're a team that perhaps struggles a little bit at country level, which enabled you to, if your midfield was going to get beaten at the stoppage and the centre bounce, you could at least have a chance to retrieve the ball at half-back and then go forward from there. And he's probably right, to be quite honest. That's why you had someone behind the ball in the first place. And maybe those rules back then were stopping 20 to 30 goal hidings like we're seeing in certain competitions. The 666 rule certainly works for forwards, but whether or not it works for country footy, I'm not sure, boys. Let's discuss it.
Yeah, and I think you talk about that, and also the man on the mark situation too. In AFL, we've seen it open up the game of AFL. It certainly made it a quicker play on, and we've certainly seen some terrific goals. The handball to the player, you draw the man on the mark in effect, and you handball to a guy running by you. They can't move off the mark, so therefore the second player has that opportunity to kick a running goal, which I think in some ways is made for a better spectacle at AFL level. But go back to the grouping of 6 players in the forward zone, 6 players in the midfield zone, 6 players into the back line, and I reckon there are some problems at local level with it. You do create not just the one-sided disparity of scores where you get the really talented sides against the maybe the more also-ran, but even if you start to take that down to junior football, and we see the games of junior football where one side is absolutely belting the other side, so you can't apply it. You have to be able to put your best players down in that defensive unit to try and stop some of the rot when you've got kids being beaten by 10 goals something to nothing. And I know that they junior colt level, and even in some of the senior colts, or in Victoria under 13s to under 16s, or under 14s to under 17s, I know that they have made their competition so that once a team gets to 10 goals, they do actually mix and match the players and so on, so that they can have a fair game of it. And I think that's a good thing. But at a A grade or senior level in football in the country, I don't think there's any evidence that the 666 is made for a better scoreline or a better game. Games that I've watched in it, I don't think it's necessarily been the worst case scenario. What Spud said seems to be worse maybe in Northern Areas, and maybe that's because Northern Areas traditionally was a low-scoring league. I mean, Northern Areas used to be where teams would win a game with 12 or 13 goals. It was just that type of dour competition, defensive football, lots of players flooding back into the back lines. That's now no longer possible in that league. But in some of the better leagues, leagues like the Barossa Light and Gawler, maybe even River Murray, maybe the 666 spectacle is a better thing for those better comps where you've got better players that maybe have played in the SANFL or the VFL at those higher levels of competition. Possibly even a league like the Wimmera football or Hume football. That's my feeling on it, that in the better quality leagues, it doesn't, to me, have the same effect, but in the, I guess, the very small leagues out in the country where you've got fewer sides, fewer population, maybe some of the old codgers running around still when they shouldn't be, maybe that's what's made for a poorer spectacle with that rule.
You'd have to ask the question whether or not these leagues and competitions actually have the opportunity to not worry about introducing a rule like that, or whether or not they have the autonomy to be able to change up various rules as they see fit to suit their own competitions. Because if they don't have that autonomy, they really should. Yeah. And I know, for example, in northern areas, I mean, that would be something I would test straight away, because a Jamestown Peterborough is going to want to play one or two guys behind the ball just to try and shore up that defence so that they're not locked into playing in their half. That's what you get at the moment with 666 in competitions that perhaps aren't elite standard, is the ball just constantly lives in one half of the field. You got guys freezing up the other end of the ground or coming up to get a kick, so the ball never goes into their forward line in the first place. That's why you're seeing scores of only 1 or 2 goals in that competition. And that's disappointing for everyone. That's not a game of footy that you want to go and see. It's not a game of footy you want to be a part of. It's not a game of footy you want to umpire or to watch or have any sort of involvement in whatsoever. So I can understand his frustration. I can understand the frustration of people thinking about this sort of stuff inside country footy. And again, it comes back to that all high and mighty ivory tower in Melbourne, the AFL. Inward thinking, not spending enough time thinking about the ramifications of the decisions they make on the broader spectrum of the sport. And that's the problem I have with a competition being the governing body of a sport. It never works, it can never work, and it's not working right now.
Just throw something at you, Jase. I know I'll bring up Mortlock Shield. I know how much you're a fan of that. Go in the case in point here where, say, a league is given the option not to have this 666 rule, and they're up against leagues that do have it, and then it's a competition like the Mortlock Shield. Aren't you going to see exactly the same thing? That side's going to get blown out the water.
Oh, maybe.
Or are they going to be forced to adopt that rule and then be uncompetitive because they're not used to playing it?
Well, maybe I think you could adjust to the rule if you absolutely had to at association level. But the other thing is, I mean, if you've got an association that is running with that rule and an association that's not running with that rule, well, I guess it depends on who's hosting as to what rules you're playing by. We've seen that work in other sports over the years, Clayton, and Major League Baseball being one. So, I mean, you could possibly do that. I mean, ideally, I think the rules need to be uniform. And that's why I come back to this 666 stuff. It's all well and good for the AFL to introduce this at the elite level and go, this is what's best for the sport at the elite level. But look at the broader picture. Is this best for the game as a whole? And we don't get that out of the AFL. All we get is, this is what's best for the AFL product. Well, I want to see what rules you can change that are better for football as a whole.
Yeah, it's a good point. And also, when you say the AFL now has 23 players, because every week somebody gets subbed out with an injury virtually, so there is 23. In country football, we're struggling in some towns to get 18 senior footballers out there of any degree of talent. Yeah. And that's another topic that we can have discussion on, the numbers that are in country sport. But I noticed on the weekend, Port McDonald, I think it might have been, kicked 38 goals against Nangwarry, who kicked 4. In the Hume Football League, I did see that Holbrook kicked, I think, 20 goals to the Murray Magpies, 2 points. A senior game of football where the senior side, now it's not the reserve side, where you're making up the numbers with 13 with the under 14 kids coming up to play with armbands on to identify them in a senior match. This is senior football where you've got reserves and under 17s and under 14s in a pretty good competition. The Hume, it's got 12 teams for those that aren't in that part of our broadcast area. And over the weekend, we see that one side kicks just 2 points. I think we've had that in other leagues too, where the side, I think Brownswell, in one of the South Australian Riverland competitions, has had the same problem, and so on and so forth. I reckon they are more serious issues where those clubs are probably not far away from the demise if they continue to lose at the level they're losing, and that's not good for country football either to see clubs go. So if we're going to see the disparity in scores that we're talking here of this rule change for the 666, if that is indeed a contributor to more one-sided games, then we are going to see clubs fold out of the system, and that's not what we need at all.
I think your point about the AFL, very valid, Jason. You mentioned the product. They're doing this for the AFL product. Is that a product on the field for the crowd watching the game, or the TV product?
Both, yeah. No, more so the TV product, yes. They want a nice, free flowing game with lots of skills and nice and quick and easy to follow, so that there's lots of action for people watching the screens around the place. But they also want bums on seats in the stadium, so that all comes to it. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about the most skilled elite athletes.
They do it every day. That's their job.
This is, so these guys are actually going to be able to hit a target from 50 metres away to get out of defence.
I don't know. I saw a few Port Adelaide players not do that the other night. But
well, for the most part. For the most part, anyway. Tell me someone who's playing in a country team that's getting flogged by 20 or 30 goals every week that can hit a teammate over 50 metres out on the wing to try and get themselves out of defence. It's not going to happen. And that's why when you change these sort of rules, you need to have that ability to look at the game as a whole. And the AFL simply does not. And it doesn't pretend that it does. It absolutely will tell you that we are focused on the elite sport of AFL football, the elite competition. That's what we are focused on. So who's focusing on country footy? Well, and there are other divisions. We've got SANFL, community footy and whatnot. But what power do they have to change rules and fix things up? I don't know the answer here, but I know that what's certainly being changed at AFL level doesn't always have to filter through to the country levels, and shouldn't in many instances. And I think that 666 rule is a good example of one that shouldn't have.
Fair enough. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for that conversation. Statman and Flowman, if you've got thoughts, folks, and you'd like to share them with us, then please do so. Get in touch with us via flowsports.com.au. That's it. That's the one. That's the one.
Flow Sports on Facebook.
Flow Sports on Facebook.
And flownews24.com.au if you would like to go to the webpage and see all those sporting stories written up by the greats like my colleague sitting over here, Jase Regan.
Looking forward to the podcast, and you can get to see our smiley, happy faces at some stage very soon as well. We'll have more on the Sports Fix coming up for you next.